Welcome back. I left off last time talking about the economic catastrophe that started brewing in the 1920s. But the problem was not just that the Fed had cut loose the reins on banks. Catherine points out that Congress had allowed businesses to create what was called the installment plan. If you were a working American and needed a new appliance, new furniture, new car, not a problem. This was before the age of television, but I'm sure that there were radio announcers saying, "Hi, this is Bob from Amos and Andy's Appliances. Are you tired of that old icebox dripping water on the floor? Want a brand new modern refrigerator but think you can't afford one? Well, if you have a job, you can. For low money down and easy monthly payments, you can have the Crosley, Frigidaire, or Kelvinator refrigerator of your dreams. Just come on down to Amos and Andy's Appliances. Do it today." Catherine says that between 1925 and 1929, installment credit more than doubled to about $3 billion. Young people today would be saying, "That ain't nothing. Student debt alone is over $1 trillion. What you need is a little perspective, kids. In 1925, our nation's entire federal budget was only a little over $3 billion. Then came October 1929 and the inevitable stock market crash. Catherine says, the great crash came on the heels of a decade of deregulation, speculation, loose credit, and increased corporate influence. Over the next 3 years, national income plunged by more than half, and 1/4 of the nation's entire workforce was unemployed. There was widespread unrest and talk of revolution. I don't know what they teach in school these days, but when I was in school, I think they mentioned unrest and maybe some talk of a revolution. They definitely did not talk about the fact that most of it was talk of a socialist revolution. What they do tell you is that along came essentially a savior by the name of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Catherine goes on for a few pages listing the ways that FDR helped middle and working class Americans and talking about the reforms that he put in place to curb corporate and Wall Street corruption of true capitalism. She does not spew as much happy talk as liberals would, but instead presents what he did pretty much in the same way that a nerd by the name of Kevin Phillips would, essentially as a compromise between corporatists and we the people. Catherine says that FDR's actions simply restored some balance to our skewed economic equation, a condition that Adam Smith guaranteed would occur with unrestrained corporatism. This is really important, and I want to point out that the COVID-19 bailouts last year and early this year have made a lot more Americans aware that the true conflict in America is not between Democrats and Republicans, but between we the people and filthy rich corporatist elites who profit from the corruption of democracy and our American economy. Something else I want to mention is that other nerds talk about how in going along with FDR's great compromise, we the people essentially made a deal with the devil. That's because at the same time that FDR was doing things that would help us, he was also busily expanding and deeply entrenching what would become an unofficial fifth branch of government accountable to him alone. Today, that unofficial fifth branch of government is known as the Deep State, and it's been transparent and accountable to no one since FDR died. I'll be talking more about that whenever I nerd whisper an extremely well-researched book entitled Day of Deceit. Next, Catherine jumps forward from the crash of 1929 to the 2008 crash and talks about how by 2010 some Republicans were admitting that more government intervention in our economy was in fact needed to prevent future economic disasters. Of course, she wrote this book in 2011 and had no way to know that when all was said and done, there would be a whole lot more said than done. The main point Catherine makes is that by 2010, economic indicators like corporate profits and GDP, gross domestic product, were growing again, indicating that our economy was recovering. There was just one problem. There is little correlation now between the GDP and the well-being of our domestic economy. This is staggering, she says, using italics to emphasize the fact that globalization has created a disconnect between what used to be reliable indicators of how our economy was doing and how it's actually doing for we the people. I wanted to mention that a few years ago, an expert at the Fed was being interviewed, and in response to a question, he came right out and admitted that we basically have two economies. He did not say that we have an economy for the rich that's doing great, measured by the stock market and all those government statistics, and another economy for the rest of us, but that's essentially what he said. What was ridiculous to me is that he seemed to have no clue whatsoever why it was that way, much less any solution to the problem, if he even saw it as a problem. Catherine says pretty much the same thing, pointing out that when pundits and politicians and economists tell us that certain numbers are on the upswing and things are improving, either they don't have a clue or they're simply lying to you. Never was that more ridiculously obvious than last summer during the COVID-19 bailouts, summer of 2020. I didn't save a screenshot from the independent news show that I saw online, but there was this money guy on one of the money TV shows that calls itself news, all happy because the line on a graph of stock prices was going up. Behind him on the studio monitor, there was a photo of hundreds of people lined up at one of America's many thousands of food banks. I didn't save that graphic, but I did save this one that was put online by a dude named Justin and then reposted by Crystal Ball on their online independent news show, Rising. This pretty much says it all, was the caption that Justin put on it, and it does. While the money guys were all happy because the stock market was booming, look at the lower part of the graphic, which I'll circle. 16 million Americans had lost their jobs in the previous 3 weeks. And the rich were all happy because their economy was booming. While for the rest of us, our economy sucked. And that goes back to what I said, what Catherine says. There's a complete disconnect between the numbers that people on these TV shows that call themselves news tell you when they tell you how the economy is doing and how our real economy is doing. I wanted to give a quick shout out to my favorite independent media nerds at Rising. Crystal is a Bernie Sanders type liberal, Sagar and Jetty, pretty much an old-fashioned Dwight Eisenhower type conservative, but these guys do good work. They only have a little over 1 million subscribers, but it's my opinion they should have over 100 million. Now, if happy, shiny, coastal elite liberals like Crystal aren't your thing, maybe you would prefer a potty-mouthed political comedian by the name of Jimmy Dore. I love this dude because he has no compunction whatsoever about speaking truth to power, which is how he attracts some of the most awesome nerds to appear on his show. In this segment, Dylan Ratigan, an economist whose book I want to nerd whisper someday. You can tell that the COVID-19 economic disaster was rough on Jimmy, because look at how gray his hair turned between this segment, the end of March 2020, and this segment in August. At least he's happy because Nancy Pelosi is praying for him. Getting back to Catherine's book, an important point she makes, since the experts can't seem to figure it out, is that out here in the real world, the millions of small businesses that are the backbone of our nation's economy can't expand and hire more people, much less pay those people better, when most Americans, most consumers as we're called, are already struggling to meet the bare necessities of life and can't go out and spend more money at those small businesses. Catherine points out that they could go deeper into debt on credit cards, but I would point out that most people are already pretty much maxed out as it is. Kind of putting our nation's economy in a nutshell, Catherine says that paying workers low wages and then extending them credit so they can buy stuff has worked out well for big corporations in America. The big corporations, I would add, that support our nation's political class. But it has pretty much gutted our nation's middle class, which is the main driver of economic growth and prosperity in our country. Which brings us into the real topic of this chapter, human capital. Catherine essentially says that back before corporations took over our government and economy, human capital was the essential currency. In other words, in the old days, people who owned businesses, even big corporations, wanted and needed to make money, but tended to think of themselves as part of a community where people mattered. To me, the best example of that is Henry Ford, who made a lot of money building high-quality cars that his well-paid workers could afford. But after the rise of the corporations to power, investment dollars became the only form of capital that really mattered, at least to the rich and powerful. Catherine goes on to point out the sick irony of human capital being devalued in what is supposedly a capitalist system. That's because in true Adam Smith style capitalism, human capital is the only kind that really matters. In other words, we the people are what true Adam Smith style capitalism is all about. Catherine sums up this chapter saying, "We've allowed large corporations to redefine our entire economic system and pervert both conservative and liberal values." She ends off talking about corporatism, saying, "Citizens need to understand just how far-reaching the implications are for everything we hold dear. When people are frightened and hurting, it's difficult to chart a brave new course. But the time is now, and the stakes could not be higher." I agree. And to me, the real tragedy is the fact that the vast majority of us are pretty awesome people. But the two-party corporatist system has divided us against one another. Neither side wanting to do right, but instead be right. Neither side seeking the wisdom to find solutions, but only seeking somebody to blame. To me, a man named Paul put the essence of what's lacking in 1 Corinthians 13, verse 11. "When I was a child, I spoke as a child, understood as a child, reasoned as a child. But when I became a man, I put aside those childish ways." In my next video, I'll be covering chapter 6. I'm going to end off this time with another verse from Corinthians. You can pause and read it if you want. I don't know, but I think Catherine would agree that along with the knowledge of what's gone wrong with our country in our heads, patriots are going to need this wisdom in their hearts if we as a people are ever going to come back together and restore our democracy. See you next time. If you like this video, why not click the like button? I'll put a link to the next episode over here.